Hi, I'm Rorri Muhammad. I live in South Florida. I'm originally from New York. I'm married. I have two children, a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old. And I'm a therapist, a parent coach, and the founder of the organization You Power Change. I've been working in the field of social work and therapy now for over 15 years, and I've worked as a school social worker, I've worked as a therapist in different places, in community settings, so I've been doing this work in all different settings for a while now. I got into the field of social work initially and therapy when my brother was adopted when I was a teenager, and he was also a teenager. And during that time, I was seeing that there were a lot of inequities that I hadn't noticed before. Being a white person and my brother being brown, there was a big difference in the way that experiences that he would have that I wouldn't have, and we were similar ages, and so things were really sticking out to me, sort of around issues around racism that were coming up. And so I felt very strongly that I needed to do something about this, and I felt very strongly that how can I get involved, how can I be part of that change, and trying to figure out what should I study at that time. I felt very drawn to social work, and I wasn't even initially thinking therapy. I actually went into social work to work initially more on like the policy side, and then came around when I was working with individuals and things like that to go back and get my license to become a therapist and bridge the two things together. A few examples of racism that I experienced seeing him, watching him experience. One thing was just, we both started driving around the same time, and he would be pulled over a lot more frequently and stopped by police than I wasn't pulled over at all. And that was something that was very stressful and worrisome, and the way that he was treated in those interactions was something that I had never experienced. And so hearing him come home and kind of share that, that's something that I had never had experienced before. Another thing that really stands out was also just the differences in sort of the settings where we were raised. I was raised, because it wasn't until we were teenagers, in a very white suburban neighborhood. And I really was not exposed to, there were people of color, but not people of color that I was close to in my life. Where he was raised, and school-wise, right, just economically with the school that I attended was mostly white and had been very resourced very, very well. He went to a school where it didn't have the same type of resources, right? It was, being a person of color and being in that school, he didn't receive the same access to resources, help, assistance, and he struggled. And so we had very different, school wasn't a struggle for me where it was for him, right? And so for us to arrive at the same place of like high school graduation was completely different ways that we arrived there, right? And just completely different struggles and experiences and things that he had to navigate that I didn't even have to touch. I definitely think my parents didn't have the tools or the resources that they needed to help both of us navigate these issues, right? As a family, and as an adoptive family, as a multiracial family, having those conversations around race and racism weren't something that they knew how to have, had the tools to have, helping both of us kind of navigate, like, in those situations that the support, they did everything they could to support him, but I think there was not so much a lack of awareness, but a lack of how to really provide the support that he needed around some of those things. And really for me and my sister as well, both of us being white, there were so many different layers, right? So one aspect was the fact that it was an adoption, and so the aspects around that of somebody new coming into your family and what that means and we're not babies at that time, right? We had already lived somewhat of our life. And then there's also the additional part of being a multiracial family and what that means. And now, especially being a white person, not having to pay attention, right? Because of white privilege, not having to think about my race, not having to go through the world where this is something that's on my mind all the time, and now it becoming something that is on my mind all the time. It was such a quick switch. I didn't know how to navigate that, and I don't think my parents had the tools to help us do that. And that's why this is so important to me, that people have the tools to be able to do this. My husband is from Guyana in South America. He's Indo-Guyanese. So my kids are also multiracial and multi-faith and multicultural since I'm white and Jewish. And so there's that dynamic as well, that my husband and I are now raising multiracial children and what that means for them in the world and growing up. So some of the anxiety that I was going through as a teenager was my own self-worth and my own self-identity of how that was showing up. I was at this point now more aware of hearing people say things about race and racism, like in school, hearing friends make comments, maybe about somebody being Mexican or somebody being this. I don't know if I would have been triggered the same way and recognized or acknowledged it enough before that. I'm not in that process, and I didn't know how to respond, but I felt a lot of emotions and I just kept it inside. So I felt like nobody really could understand. I was sitting in school all day, and I felt like I had so many different experiences than other people next to me. Not that that was necessarily true, but I wasn't communicating any of it, so I have no idea what anybody else was going through. I just completely felt what I was going through. And so I felt like I knew about this whole other world of racism that other people didn't understand. And so I felt really different, and I didn't know how to navigate that. And that caused me a lot of anxiety. I just remember questioning myself a lot. I remember feeling just very insecure about my feelings and not feeling that I had that validation. So I think that caused a lot of anxiety at the time. For me, I was very shy in general at the time. And I feel like it's a complete turnaround from now, which is awesome. But that he was and still to this day, my brother's very charismatic, he's very outgoing, he's very open. Even him, he was making jokes about people being white and things like that. I hadn't even heard those things before. I didn't even know that was a thing, being white, really. So even those jokes, white people, blah, 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 things, little things like that. I don't remember he's just very, he would just share things. And so I think I was just taking it all in and processing it. And it's interesting, kind of just reminding me, talking about these things, his journey as well for his own culture and things that even though he grew up with a lot of his culture before he was adopted, when he went to college, studying and going into just Mexican culture and studying so much about Mexico and learning about Mexican history. And so I was able to learn some things just through his also studying at that time. But just he would just get sometimes videos, right? Videos about Mexican history, and just be watching them in the house, and his own process of identity that he was going through, which I learned. And actually, I went to study Spanish because of him. I would hear him talking on the phone. I mean, he is completely in English too, but he'd have some friends that he would talk to just in Spanish, and I'd be the nosy little sister. Well, I want to understand what he's saying, and so I went and learned Spanish, years and years and years. But I mean, obviously became more to the just the purpose of learning. But my original reason to learn Spanish was because I wanted to understand what he was saying. And so that was a big part of it. And so watching him go through this journey of him really exploring his own history and feeling I missed out on so much of that too. Why didn't everybody learn these things, right? And so that's kind of when those things started to click for me. Why wasn't this in our curriculum? Everybody, this is part of world history, but we're not learning so many of these things. I think a lot of the situations that would come up is if we're at a restaurant, they would be oh, is there 4 of you? Or how many people are in your party, right? To sit down at a restaurant, and it would be oh, is he with you or not with you? The other thing that would happen a lot that made me feel really uncomfortable, and it wasn't that things necessarily were said, but this idea when me and him were together, that they would think that people wouldn't assume we're brother and sister, but they would more likely assume, are we dating? Or friends, or more something like that, that the idea of, are they together, is something that would bother me, and that perception of what that would be. Being a multiracial family, and there's so many different layers to it that people don't recognize the emotions and the things that come up that are related to this. So many layers to that of what that meant. And so in so many spaces where we show up, what does that mean? What are people, and it's so much, I think there's so much anxiety about it, because it's well, what are other people thinking? Yes, because we don't care about what other people think, right? But when you're a teenager, you care, right? And when you're growing up, you do care about those things. And I mean, I can't think of a time specifically. Well, when someone said something directly to us necessarily, but I can see, if you see like confused looks, like you see people like trying to figure out like how do you all fit together as a family? What is this connection type of thing? I decided to start You Power Change based on experiences that I was seeing in my work where there was a really big disconnect between the way that I was working with clients and the systems that we were all functioning within, and that the systems and the way that things were running were not meeting the needs of the clients. And so there was this really big disconnect of systemic problems and challenges not being addressed in sort of this clinical work and being addressed in one-to-one direct services. And so I started You Power Change as a way of bridging that gap and bringing the individual and family piece together with the systemic piece. Our mission is really working for a world of racial equity where children, the next generation, future, and families can grow up in a loving, inclusive, and safe world, right? That's really so important and why I created You Power Change. One of the ways that we do this is we have a program for white moms raising children of color that focuses on communication. So we focus on how do we talk about some of these hard things? How do we show up in some of these spaces? What do we need to say? What do we need to not say, right? How do we do our own work? We talk about what does it look like as a white person to really understand white privilege? How do we look at our white fragility? And so one of our programs is around that, right? Helping white moms raise children of color and what that means and everything that holds. I would explain white privilege as being able to go through the world without having to think about race or racism, right? That it's this idea of being white, kind of being this idea of neutral in a way. And so it's that if I don't choose to think about my race, I don't have to in a way before, right? And that's the aspect of the privilege of it. And not even being aware necessarily of the trauma and the things that come aware with being a person of color in a culture that is based on white supremacy. So an example of white privilege, right? The fact that I can go into the store and not having to be followed by someone thinking that I'm gonna take something or I'm gonna steal something. The fact that, like I said, like when I was driving, I don't have to worry about getting pulled over in the same way that he is and as my brother is, and I don't have to worry if I am stopped that the interaction, that my life is on the line, right? I can feel it's not something that I have to be triggered with trauma in that instance. I don't have to worry. I mean, even coming back to me, I worked in a school for a long time with many young people of color, and there were many black students that would just get stopped on the way to school, like the whole stop and frisk policy, right? That they, just for walking on their way to school, to be stopped for no reason to check, do they have something on them? They're automatically assumed that they are a criminal as opposed to being assumed that they're just a student on their way to school, or being assumed that, like, it's assumed they're doing something wrong as opposed to they're doing something right. Reverse racism is not a thing. Racism is power plus privilege. That's the definition of racism. So I think what happens is people use that kind of as a defense mechanism a lot of times, this idea of reverse racism, because it feels, how do we hold this idea that all white people are racist in a way because we're part of a system that supports white supremacy culture, right? And so a lot of times it's that idea of if I'm being labeled as racist is I'm bad, and if I'm not racist, then I'm good. And so when we use that dichotomy of bad and good for those terms, that gets in the way, right, of us really doing the work of what being actively anti-racist is, and what does it mean to be a white person and being actively anti-racist. And so when someone says the term reverse racism, they may be having experiences and feelings about something that's going on but that term, that language, they're struggling to find the right language to describe it. There might be another aspect of their identity that is oppressed in a certain way, right? Like there's sort of this idea of intersectional or intersectionality. And so maybe there's an aspect of their identity. So me being Jewish, right, that's an aspect where maybe it's not the mainstream and it's sort of an area that could be oppressed in a way, but it doesn't mean that it's reverse racism isn't the right term for that. There are other terms that could be used for that idea of feeling like they're being discriminated against. And someone could be discriminated against or someone could be prejudiced, but because you hold the power as a white person in this society, that's why that term doesn't work. One of the things that I think happens is people really struggle in how to have conversations about race and racism with their children and just in their life. And that really impacts both their parenting, their communication with their child, the way they're raising their child, so the trauma that their child may experience. And so really the common thing is really being able to, struggling to kind of have the language to process it and talk about it and work through challenges that are coming up. I think sometimes it just becomes overwhelming. And so it's a struggle of how do I do this work to be white and be anti-racist while raising my child, right? Most parents, I think, want to do best by their children. They love their children and they want to do what's best for them. Sometimes I think they don't always see it or they don't always know necessarily what that is or what that looks like and don't want to necessarily do some of the work, the internal work they have to do themselves to process their own racial identity and what's going on with that. And so if they're raising a child and the child has an experience at school, a racist experience, or maybe their child is also maybe living in a neighborhood where they're one of the few children of color at their school, what that means for them growing up and the parent really having to understand what that means. And I think it's not always necessarily pushback, but I think just not recognizing the magnitude of what that experience is. And the parent, yes, wanting to support their child, but struggling on what does this look like? I believe it's very important to be proactive as a parent. I also think it's necessary to be reactive when something happens because you don't want to let it go. But I definitely think it's important to be proactive in addressing these things. It's important that you're not just having one conversation about race with your child, with your family. You're not just having one conversation about what racism is, what it looks like, how do we navigate this, how do we challenge this. That it's something that is in your everyday life, right? This is something that your child is dealing with every day, and so it's something that you have to opt in to deal with every day. And that it's not, you don't have the luxury of checking out because it's going to harm your child, and so that's not okay. And so it is important to be proactive in all areas of life. And I mean, when I think proactive, it's not only the conversations you're having with your kid, it's the conversations you're having with the rest of your family, right? It's the conversations that you're showing up at the school and making sure what's in that curriculum. Does the teacher understand how to appropriately teach in a way that all kids feel like they belong to this class community? And so many different layers of what that looks like showing up in your life. It's really, really hard and tough if you have a family member that's racist, and how navigating how to deal with that can be really tough. And I think there's a few different ways to really approach that. One is you need to protect your child, right? You want your safety of your child there. So I know a lot of people, it is very common, right, to cut off that family member and say, okay, I'm just done with them. But I also think by saying you're done with them is you not using your white privilege in a way that can also make change, right? That means that person is still out in the world acting this way towards other people. And so, yes, you're protecting your child, but you're also not doing your work. And so I think one approach that I find that's very helpful is using like a relational family therapy approach. So this idea that our things are based on relationships, right? And so you have this relationship with your parent already, who is the grandparent of your child. How do you use that relationship in a way and make that connection and work towards that change of them understanding and opening up? And it's not something that happens overnight, right? It is a process. And so they may not be allowed to be around your child until some of that change happens. But I don't think I don't think it's a best practice to opt out of it. I do think sometimes you have to also take care of yourself and do self-care as a parent, but I think there's a lot of ways to approach it, and that it's important that all the ways are being addressed, and it's not just I'm cutting them off and they're out of my life, because it means that this person is still showing up in the world acting this way. It's so important that kids can have people that look like them in their life to see, to connect with. It's so important that kids have models of what this looks like, right? What does it mean to, when they're only in your household, right? If they don't have people that look like them, it's confusing, right? And they don't know, they're able to get a sense of belonging, a sense of connection by having these racial mirrors. And so examples of that, there's so many different ways of that, right? It can be done, it's very important, right, to have people in your life, physical people in your life that are racial mirrors for them, but it's also important to have that in your house, right? So books that reflect their identity, dolls that reflect their identity, right? Artwork that's representing their identity. And there's so many different ways of putting racial mirrors in their life, but really the strongest is making sure that there are people in their life that look like them. Where is this push for the importance of racial mirrors? Like, where is that coming from? And I do think a lot of it is adults speaking out about their lack of not having that and what that's meant to them and how that's been harmful and how a sense of belonging was missing for them, a sense of community, a sense of connection. So I do think that's a big part of it. I also think that there have probably been people all along, right, that have been saying this and that their voices just weren't heard. And it's terrible and messed up that that wasn't highlighted. And I think now it's awesome that these conversations are happening. And I think there's also just more talk about race and racism right now than had been happening before. And I think, there's so many different reasons for that, but so many people of color have done amazing things pushing for this. And I think finally white people are waking up to say, like, it's about time we listen, right? Like, and it's so terrible that it's taken this long and that this much harm has been done. Just the idea of racial trauma that happens, that's just not addressed so much, right? Just the effects that it can have, having to go through a world where your identity is oppressed, right? And what that looks like and how that affects someone, right? Now, I'm speaking as a white person, so I can only speak, right, to that, right? So I obviously a person of color, a Black, Indigenous person of color would have, be able to speak, of course, to that directly. But from my experience, what I've seen is just just knowledge-wise, racial trauma has such an impact that's not talked about, that only I feel like even recently has really even started making news, mainstream news that people are actually that are reading. It's always, I guess, been talked about, but not in a space where it's showing up as national news. And so racial trauma really having the effect of depression and anxiety and what that means when you have an identity that's marginalized, when your racial identity is marginalized. And so when you're adopted, that's an additional layer of what that looks like, right? And so you're navigating this process of how do I deal with any of the trauma that kind of comes with this, whether it's microaggressions, whether it's this, and still kind of figuring out your own identity, right? What is your own personal identity and what does that look like, right? Because it's your own, it's your racial plus cultural background, right? And so what's your cultural background? What does that look like? How is that in addition to what your parents' cultural background might be? And even if it's similar, right, it's still how does that show up in when somebody looks at you, right? That people make assumptions, that there's a lot of multiracial families, multicultural families are so common, but yet they're not necessarily the norm in what we kind of see on TV or the way that things are. So if somebody looks at me, they're not gonna just assume that my brother is of Mexican heritage and that my husband is from Guyana. But it doesn't mean that those things aren't part of the kind of the culture that I'm now part of in a way, right? This new sort of mixed culture of things that my family is going to do, right? So ways that we're going to spend time together as a family, or show up to go to certain events, or have certain traditions, right? What that looks like, and people wouldn't necessarily know that that's part of my identity as right now by looking at me. And I think that's what happens a lot also, right? For someone who is in that position as adoptee, having to navigate so many levels of trauma, right? There's the adoption trauma, there's racial trauma, there's just so many different aspects of trauma that happen in addition to just trying to navigate your own identity of what that looks like. With kids that are adopted, I think a big themes that come up is both loss as well as sense of belonging. I think those are two really main themes, and just giving guidance to parents on those two topics, right? What that looks like. I think making space for those emotions, right? When we think about loss, there needs to be space to process that loss. There needs to be space. Is there any way to regain some of that, right? Like some parents, if you have an open adoption, what can you maybe do to minimize some of that loss, right? How do you connect with the family in that way? As far as processing, just maybe connecting the child to a therapist that can process that loss if you're not able to do it. I think also even talking about it, reading books about it, just going through, part of like this grieving process of what that can look like, and sort of this lifelong journey of what it and how it might feel, and that it's okay for them to feel different ways at different times in their life. The sense of belonging, I think, is how do we kind of create the sense of belonging to also mitigate some of that? And that's a sense of belonging within your own family of sort of these new, are there any new traditions that the family is doing, traditions that you're creating together? Are there things what spaces are you showing up as a family together? What spaces is your child in? Is your child in spaces with people that look like them? Are you in spaces with people that look like your child, right? And really understanding as best as you can your child's experience. And one of the best ways to do that is also to create really strong open communication within your family. I think it's really important that a child is able, you're teaching your child to be able to express their emotions, but you're also holding space for them to do that. You're not judging them, you're not telling them their feeling is wrong, you're not trying to fix their feelings, right? And a lot of times as parents, we want to do that, right? We want to try to fix our kids' feelings, and that's not always the best way to do it, right? There's a way to hold space for the hard feelings, for the sad feelings, and help them learn how to work through it. So if a child is feeling that, this feeling of they don't belong or feeling other, and it's not the right response, right, to say, oh, but you're so beautiful, because that invalidates and dismisses really how they're feeling, right? So what's important is, I think for the parent, the first thing is make sure you check your own emotion first before you even go to address the child. Because you hearing that, right, you're trying to address, you want your child to be okay, but it's bringing up your own, sometimes it can trigger your own stuff, and it sometimes prevents us from responding in the way that's most beneficial for our child. So I think when we're responding to that, you don't want to dismiss what your child is saying. You want to validate, to say, you're feeling like you don't belong, that must be really hard, right? What has that been like for you? What are some of the experiences you've had? And let your child share with you what's making them feel like they don't belong. And then you're able to say, well, what can I now do to help them feel a stronger sense of belonging, right? Is it that they don't have kids around them that look like them? Is it that somebody said something that makes them feel other? Is it that their culture's not addressed in school, right? Like they're not learning about that in the curriculum, right? They don't see themselves in history books. Or is it something, so many different things it can be, or so many different, you want to really get to you want to validate what your child is saying, and then really, really listen. I think one of the things as parents, we're also often jumping to trying to solve it instead of taking the time to just listen, and sometimes you have to just sit with it and process. And what does it mean when it's hard, when it feels like this? And I think connecting them with other people who have had similar feelings is one of the most important things, right? Because if you haven't been in that experience, you may not have the right words that they need in that moment. And they may need someone else to say, I've been there, you're gonna get through it. Even you can say they're gonna get through it, but having someone who's actually been there and can say, look, I've gotten through it, this are some of the things that I did, to give that advice, it's different coming from somebody else. A child sort of rejects things from their culture, or other times when they want to be, and may even say, I want to look like my parent or something like that, right? And sort of, so both the rejection as well as desiring the other or whatever it is, instead of just kind of being okay and happy with, right, with their sense of self. And I think to recognize, and parents need to recognize, right, it's a process, right? And this can be a phase they're going through, and that they may have to work through that phase, right? And I think it's really important for parents to understand, where is that coming from? Is it coming from inside sources that maybe they're not recognizing, maybe messages they're unintentionally sending? Is it coming from outside sources? Are they receiving messages just because maybe TV, they're not seeing representations of themselves on TV or representations of themselves in other spaces of their life? And so I think it's important to understand, to dig a little bit deeper into why they might be rejecting it now. Have they always rejected it, or did all of a sudden like a new phase start? They're at a certain age now and they're starting to say, oh, I don't want to learn, I don't want to work on that language anymore, or right, I don't want to eat that food. And really also letting them choose their own path, and they're allowed to make their own choices and navigate. And that's part of like finding their identity as well, that even if you're not in an adoptive family, right, everyone goes through this process of identity and trying to navigate who they are. And so part of it is also just kind of normalizing that this is a process of identity too, that children and especially adolescents, right, especially during adolescence, it's figuring that out and navigating it during that time. It's not even acknowledging, right, all this loss that's happening. It's becoming more of a celebration. But who is celebrating? Who are we celebrating? It's not acknowledging this, that there's multiple emotions that can happen at the same time. And I think that's one of the really big limitations. I know one of the things that comes up, and even hearing this makes me think of, even just with my brother and my mom, that a lot of times some feelings still to this day, being adults and grown, are shared in a way that it's protective of my mom, right? Like, and so for a child, of course, the child's gonna want to protect the parent. So they're having to sometimes minimize their own emotions or change the way that they're verbalizing their emotion, and not being fully honest because maybe the parent can't hear it, or they already know what the parent's response is going to be, and so it really takes away from the child to really be able to be their full self. Right? The child isn't able to show up fully because they're not accepted in that way. All aspects of them, or maybe it's too upsetting, right? If it's too hard to go to the situation of loss, too hard to sort of, for the parent to address it. And so then the child is never able to navigate that, is never able to work through what this means and to fully hold all of what this is. The child is a whole person, right? How do they fully hold all of these things within themselves? For a parent who feels that their child seeking out their first parent is a personal statement or a personal issue against them, or feeling like they did something wrong and this is why the child is seeking that out, or they should have done something different and the child wouldn't be seeking this, that it's sort of this, kind of like this natural thing, right? People, you want to know where you come from. You want to have these connections, right? A lot of times people are interested in their background or their ancestors or things like that, to understand that it's nothing to do with you. It's not a negative for your child to want to seek this person, this family out. It's them in their self-identity journey, in their journey of understanding who they are. And my advice is really for a lot of things is that we need to process our emotions as parents separately from the interactions we're having with our kids, right? Because it can be very damaging if we're taking it personal, right? We don't want our child to feel like I have to choose or I'm feeling pulled, because that's a horrible feeling, right? And that's not the case at all, right? In most cases, your child knows you love them, they're in a loving home, this is their family, but it doesn't mean that, it doesn't negate their other family, right? It doesn't negate these other people that are part of their life. And whatever that journey may take them, everybody's story is different, right? But whatever that will look like, your support in this process is huge. For me too, looking for my own therapist, right? And in this process, that has been a struggle for me myself. When I was younger, not even knowing to really even look for an adoption therapist. Like, that's how vague it was to me. Like, this process of what was happening, it didn't even really have it had the label of adoption, but I don't even know that I fully understood that. And so trying to find a therapist, I wasn't even sure what I was looking for. And this is before most of my training, and even after some of my training, to find someone that can meet the needs of both being part of an adoptive family and some of those dynamics that still come up, that right, and all the things that add to it. In addition to just being part of a multiracial family, having someone that can address issues of race and racism and what that means and how to navigate some of those things. That's been a huge struggle. So I would say that working even for adults, that there's definitely a lot there as well, and that there's not that many people, I don't think, doing this work in a way that is successful. My advice for hopeful adoptive parents would really be to do as much research and engagement and really understanding your child's experience. If you can, stay connected to the family of origin in any way, shape, and form in most cases. I think that can have a very, very positive impact. Bringing in your child's the culture of your child, recognizing that, and knowing that there's going to be a lot of changes in your family, but that also that you can do it. The advice I have for parents raising multiracial families, and specifically through adoption, right, is it's so important to talk. Conversation, communication is one of the main things. It's really important that there's open communication. It's really important that you are talking about race and racism with your child. It's really important that you're talking about culture. It's really important that you are addressing so many aspects, right, of what your child's experience is, that you're holding space for feelings of loss, that you're holding space for creating the sense of helping them, guiding them for a sense of belonging and what that means. And recognizing it's not just only in your insular family, right? It's what does this mean in the outside world? Helping them navigate, and yourself making space, right? Helping them navigate what this is in school, what this is when they're with their friends. How do they talk about it? What do they say? What if their friend says this? How are they feeling about that? And really just having and being aware of what the true experience that your child's going through, and connecting with other families. A community is so important. That's one of the things I tell almost everybody, right? Make sure you have community of people that can support you, but are going through something similar, right? You want to be connected with people who have been there before you, and you want to be connected with people who are going through it at the same time. So you're able to get the advice that you need and hear it in different ways, because a lot of times we might have a question and we don't always have the answers, and that's okay. You don't have to always have the answers, but you have to always be willing to look and research and go get it. And I think it's okay to, if a child asks a question, to say, I don't know, but I'm gonna find out, or I don't know, let's come back to this, if you really don't have the answer at that moment. Sometimes there's so much fear around how do we ask this question without it being offensive or being looked at as I'm a bad parent, that we don't even ask it. I want to just push people to ask the question. Even if you need to learn a different way to reword it in the future, at least you're gonna find out the information. To just continually seek out information that can help your family, help your child, and help you as a parent. There's a lot of advice that I would tell my teenage self. I mean, the first thing would have been go to therapy and find someone that specializes in adoption issues around transracial adoption, and search until you find someone. I think I also would have told myself that this is a process and that it's going to take some time, that there was a huge transition that just happened in my family, and it's okay that it takes some time to figure this out, that it's not something that has to be figured out. I think I would have also pushed myself more to try to, I mean, I don't know how much teenagers could do this, but I think they can, right? I think had I known, tried to push my whole family to go to family therapy at that time. Because if my parents didn't have the tools, I wish they would have had the tools. But if they didn't have the tools, I would have hoped I could have pushed them in a way to get the guidance for the tools that I needed. I wish I would have known other people that were in my situation, other siblings that were going through transracial adoption. And I even had this conversation in college with a therapist that I went to the college counseling center and trying to kind of explain this is kind of, and I was very focused more on like anxiety because that was the feeling that was coming up for me, a lot of things. I wasn't able to necessarily put the connections like from my family's situation together that I can put together now and understand, okay, well, this is why I was feeling a lot like some of those things. But I wished, it was also before a lot of like Facebook groups didn't exist and things like that didn't exist, but I wish someone could have said, go to this group, you're gonna meet other people that are in that situation, you're not the only one going through this. So hearing that, I think, would have been helpful. I think say adoption is a lifelong journey. It's something that you're navigating throughout your life at different stages at your life, and all family members at different times are navigating it in different ways and processing it in different ways. And it's something that you may feel is gonna feel a multitude of emotions at different times and different phases of your life. I think adoption means a lot of things to me. I think adoption is families coming together as well as families being separated and new families being formed. Personally, for my personal experience with adoption, it was very much this blended open family experience. And so in that route, there's still this sense though, sort of the sense of loss. And so I think adoption just means that it's something that really needs to be treated with great care, I think with a lot of support, and recognizing that there's so many different layers to it, that adoption really just has so much in it and as part of it.